Welcome to the Circuit Rider Bible Study with Andy Brink.
I'm going to start in Acts, the book of Acts, chapter 9. Acts, chapter 9. I'll read verses 1 through 9, and then we'll get started. It says, Now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters for him to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And it came about that as he journeyed, approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter to the city, and it shall be told thee what you must do. And the men who traveled with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. And Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. And leading him by the hand, they brought him to Damascus. And he was there 3 days without sight, and neither ate or drank. And then God raises someone up to come see him. But as we look at the beginning of this chapter, it says Saul was on his way to persecute all those belonging to the way. And you really begin to think about, what was one of the first descriptions of a Christ follower? What was one of the first descriptions? How did they categorize? How did they speak of those who were following Christ, discipled by Him, receiving His teachings? They were people of the way. They weren't even necessarily called Christians. They were, and you can see even now sometimes. I was talking with somebody and they said, I just have a hard time being called a Christian or wanting to be called a Christian because I don't necessarily want to be identified with some of the things that I have seen that I don't feel like are really very Christ-like. But when you think about our lives, do people, when they recognize you, do they say, that person walks a different way? Do they say something different about the path of your life, the road of your life, the journey of your destination, where you're headed? There was something at that point in that place where they described these people as being a part of this way, this teaching, this direction. I'm reminded of Romans 10, where it says, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that Christ raised Him from the dead, you shall be saved. And again, that word to confess means to say the same thing as. See, there were a people that were saying the same thing Christ was saying. It wasn't just, I believe intellectually that there was a man named Jesus and He died on that cross and They were reciting and saying the same things He taught. They were agreeing with Him. They were in their heart lined up with Him. So what was coming out of their mouth, the direction of their life, that's how they were described. Look with me in Matthew chapter 7. And really verse 13, but just because I like verse 12, I'm going to share that one. It says, Therefore, whatever you want others to do for you, do also for them, for this is the law and the prophets. So think about that. He says, here's the law and the prophets. Treat other people the way you want to be treated. Do unto others as you would want others to do unto you. And he says this law and the prophets, listen, it is something that, just like the law of gravity, it's a spiritual law that is there and it's going to be there. Whatever you give out, you're going to receive in return. Pressed down, shaken together, running over. So he goes on to verse 13. He goes into, enter by the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction. and many are those who enter in by it. For the gate is small, and the way is narrow that leads to life, and few are those who find it. So, as we look first in Acts, and it says, there is a way, there are a people that are described by the way that they live, the way that they walk, the road that they're on, the path that they journey. There's another passage in, I believe it's Proverbs, I think it's chapter 9, but it says, there is a way, and that word way means the same thing, a road, a path, that there's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it's death, it's destruction. And that word right, it means there's a way that seems straight. There's a path that seems, it appears. That word seems, it means it appears to be. You know, you look at it, it appears, it seems like this. This path seems to be straight. But all of a sudden he says, listen, the end result of that path, though it may seem straight, is death. And right here when Jesus in Matthew says, listen, there is a broad way, and its end will be destruction. Yet in our mind, in the natural mind, Romans chapter 8, verse 5, it says, the natural mind, the mind on the flesh is death. You know, there's a way that seems right. And sometimes this broad way, it appears to be right. It's more inclusive. There's nothing necessarily that one has to aim at on this broad way. Matter of fact, there are many people going on this journey. I heard somebody say to me about a certain movement, and this was a while back in a certain circumstance, but there's so many people. How could so many people be wrong? And sometimes we judge things by how many people are engaged, how many people are involved, how many people believe this, how many people adhere to this. It must be right. Look at the success of what's happening with it. And so it says there's a broad way. And when I think of that broad way, one of the things that comes to my mind, you ever hear that saying, you couldn't hit the broad side of a barn? The idea there is, listen, anybody can hit that. If I was taking a baseball or a rock and somebody said, can you throw it down there and hit the walls and stuff like that? Well, I don't have to be much of a pitcher. I can throw the ball and I'll hit something. I don't necessarily have to aim at anything. But if you tell me, Andy, hit that water faucet or hit the white part sticking out, the narrower it gets, the more discipline is required. The more endurance, the more practice, the more engagement. And so often, I really think I'm just giving you an opinion, but in this generation that we have now, this generation coming up, some of the descriptions of this generation, an unwillingness to work. Wanting everything easy. They're not willing to aim at, to endure. We want things given to us. We want things to be easy. One of the things that described what we call that greatest generation, they'd come through the Depression. They'd gone into World War II. They were a people that worked. They knew they need to. They put their hand to the plow, and I'm just speaking in the natural sense. But now we've got a generation that, if it's hard, listen, even in society, we're trying to broaden things out where people don't necessarily win trophies. There's not necessarily a first place.
Everybody gets one.
We want to make it, but you know what, listen, we say that, but I can understand. I've been in places where my kid's not the one winning, and you begin to think to yourself, well, why or why not, or why does that person? And so let's just broaden everything out. Let's just make it where nobody wins. Let's just make it where, and so you have all of this. Jesus begins to say, listen, there is a narrow way. And he says, few are going to be those that are going to enter in that direction. Because that is going to involve endurance. It's going to involve aiming at. Look with me in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. The other passage was in Proverbs 14:12. There's a way that seems right. And that word seems, it means to give an impression or a sensation of being something. An impression. Doesn't mean that it is, but it just gives the impression of something. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Again, you've heard this passage before, but it says, do you not know, and he says that obviously as if certainly you know this, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you might win. Now listen, think about what he's saying. Here this writer's communicating by the power and presence of the Holy Spirit, and he's speaking to a church, and he's saying, don't you know that in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? And he tells them, run in such a way that you might win. Now listen, we don't want to talk about those scriptures. What we would rather talk about is we're not saved by works, though any man should boast, but we're saved by grace. And we so focus on those things that nobody is willing to engage and move forward because everything becomes works. Everything does. And then we make that a canopy, an excuse to justify laziness and passivity in our heart. Paul here is challenging the church. And he's saying, listen, though everyone runs, only one receives the prize. Here's how you need to walk your life out. Run in such a way that if only one was to receive the prize, it would be you. Amen. Engage in that way. Now listen, let's finish this. Verse 25. And everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore, I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the ear. But I buffet my body and make it my slave, lest after preaching to others, I myself be disqualified. So that last part he says, therefore, he's referring to what the analogy he just gave of running the exercise and the games. And he says, those, first of all, when you run, you aim to win. Secondly, he says, in aiming to win, you have to discipline yourself to prepare for the games. And then he says, because of this, I buffet my body, but not without purpose and aim. Listen, Paul's saying there are sacrifices that are necessary for my life. Why? Because I'm aiming at something. I'm looking towards something. I'm heading in a direction. Now, the other thing I would say, and I just watch the way different people train, and prepare for things. Some people might train 6 days a week and eat nothing but the best stuff and run the best way and make themselves sleep. But one day a week they might allow themselves some chocolate. Somebody else might look at that and say, I can't believe you're eating chocolate. But maybe one day a week they might give themselves a little place to watch a movie. I can't believe you would do that. Listen, we find ourselves judging the other way other people run. He's making it personal. You have to decide how you're going to run this race. You're going to have to decide the importance of winning this race. How much time, how much effort, how much sacrifice are you willing to put toward this in order to finish well? And he says, the sacrifices that I'm making in my life are not without purpose. Listen, if there are things going on in my life and I'm saying, I'm going to set this aside, but I don't have a purpose or a reason for it, I can easily justify bringing that back in. It was somebody else I was talking to. They were talking about giving something up, and it was about facial, like a nose ring. And somebody said, if you give that up for the wrong reason, well, if you give it up just to please people, you're going to put it back in. Now listen, I'm not opposed to it. One of my daughters has a little stud, and I think it looks beautiful on it. It fits her just right. But I'll say this. If you're doing it and the Lord begins to say you're doing it for the wrong reasons, and you take it out, then you have a reason. And you put it away and you never go back to it. Listen, if your issue is alcohol, and you're an alcoholic, and God begins to say, listen, you've got to set this thing aside to move forward. Then you set it aside. But I can just tell you, if you set it aside because somebody's telling you, you shouldn't do this, you can't do this, look what happens when you do this, you'll set it aside for a season, but you'll pick it back up. And so these sacrifices, that when you do it with aim and purpose, there's a reason behind it. Paul says, listen, you may look at the things that I do, and you may look at that and think, well, that's not necessary, Paul. But he says, the things that I do are not without purpose. There's a reason for what I'm doing. I want to ask you tonight, do you take this journey seriously? Listen, sometimes we take our health seriously, and we'll go out of the way to, drink things. I've got a video of Rebecca. Listen, she has given me so much stuff, and I took something and, But the things that we'll do to try to be healthy, the things that we'll put our bodies through. Some people run every day for 8 miles, and they're not even running marathons. They put their bodies through these things trying to live long and do well. Some people, because they're afraid of losing their mind, they do crossword puzzles every day, all day long, trying to keep their mind sharp. Listen, what effort or energy are we putting in the cultivation of our spirit? That's what Paul's saying here to a church. He didn't stop and say, you know what, guys, listen, don't get caught up in how you run this race. It's not that important. Yeah, you've started the journey off. Just relax. That's not what he said. He said, listen, run that you might win. How much effort are you putting toward this journey? To finish well. To please the Lord. Look with me back in Matthew chapter 7 again. And he goes on and he says in verse 15, it says, beware of the false prophet. Now I just find that interesting that it comes right after talking about a narrow way. Now listen, there's always going to be those that seem to represent God. And they're going to take the narrow way and just broaden it out a little bit. Just widen it a little bit. Just stretch it out a little bit.
Tolerant. Everybody's welcome. It's inclusive.
Totally. It's inclusive. Or, just recently, it doesn't really, matter about this. And listen, everybody's doing that. It's not a big deal. We live in a different society, a different time. There's all kinds of reasonings to justify our own flesh, our own selfishness, and what we want. I was talking to somebody about marriage, and it was a young person. They weren't getting married yet, but we were talking about it, and I said, listen, marriage is death. And they looked at me like, what? And I said, but you got to keep in mind, when you look at it from God's perspective, or the desire to walk with the Lord, that's how you walk in love. You choose to die to yourself for the sake of the needs of someone else. You care enough about them to give up your right to be right. You choose to lay down your life. Marriage is a cross. And then God brings children into your life.
There's some more.
How many things would you do differently if you didn't have children in your life? It brings another cross. Dying to what you would want. The way you would spend your life. Because now you have these responsibilities for people that you love. This journey becomes a cross. And that, when I first came to Christ, I thought I'd surrendered all my heart. But what I found out as I'm walking, that way just continues to narrow down. And in the process of that narrowing down, He begins to strip everything away that's unlike Him. And that's the mystery of the gospel. It's the end result. The mystery of this gospel is Christ formed in you, the hope of glory. And if there's anything we wish to hold on to, we will listen to somebody that tells us we can spread that way out a lot farther.
It's interesting, too, that you spread your pathway out and the word went away from you.
That's a good point. Did you notice what he just said? As I spread the way away, the word got further away from me. That's actually an excellent point. And the further we get away from the word, the more we begin to depend upon the books of men. And the books of men that explain the word, we begin to spend more time with that because we don't want to take it for what it says. And we begin the process of watering it down. So he begins to say, keep in mind what it's in relationship. Now, aren't you grateful that today there's not false prophets?
Oh.
Now think about it. Listen, Jesus had no problem stepping in, and he didn't. Listen, he said, listen, I'm telling you. Do you remember what Paul said in the book of Acts when he was speaking to this group of people and his journey was coming to an end? He said, guys, I'm telling you, I'm about to leave. And there are going to be wolves that are going to come in. And they're going to try to devour the flock. The book of Jude. He says, listen, I meant to write you about your common salvation. But then I felt the need to tell you to contend for the faith, because there are those who unnoticed have crept into your love feast. And it says he describes them as clouds without water. They look like, we need, probably, I don't know about here, we've been through pretty much a drought up further north. There hadn't been rain in a month or so. And all of a sudden you see a cloud. It begins to be overcast. It looks like rain. It gives you the hope and the appearance of rain. But then it passes on. There's no rain. He said there are those who give the appearance of rain. They say a lot. There's a lot of emotion that comes with them. But there's no life in what they speak. And so he says, beware, watch out, be on the alert for false prophets, those who will represent Christ, but they'll make the narrow way much broader. Then he goes on, and I'm going to skip down to verse, let's just read it since we're heading that direction. Verse 16, you will know them by their fruits. Aren't you glad that's not important? He says, you're going to know them by their fruits. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from bushes, nor figs from thistles, are they? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but the rotten tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a rotten tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then, you will know them by their fruit. Now, this is verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Now think about that for a moment. We've all heard these passages, but it's necessary to be reminded of it. He says, not everybody who says, Lord, Lord, is going to enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, my goodness. Wait a minute. What if I get there and how do I know? God, do you pick and choose? How do you do this? No, because he makes it clear. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. And then he goes on, he says, they'll say, did we not prophesy in your name? In your name cast out demons? In your name perform many miracles? Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Now, what is lawlessness? Breaking the law. What is the law? Love the Lord with all your heart. And the second one is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Now God has established a law. Jesus came not to abolish that law, but he came to fulfill that law. And then in Romans 8, he says, listen, when you have come to a place of faith and you've looked up upon the serpent, it says, even as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And you realize he took why didn't he put on the top of that pole a gold pear? Why did he put a serpent? Because the serpent represents sin. Jesus, when he went to the cross, he who knew no sin became sin. He became sin on that cross. Those who identify with him on that cross by faith, Lord, you took my corruption. You took my pride and anger and resentment and lust. You took it. You became that. You experienced the wrath of God so that now I can receive mercy through faith and I can receive grace. Now, what does that grace do in my life? It teaches me to deny ungodliness and worldly lust. It instructs me on how to live sensibly, righteously, and godly in this present age. So therefore, Romans 8, just as Jesus fulfilled the law of love, Romans 8 says the Spirit has come within you to fulfill God's law through you. Listen, the presence of the Spirit of God has come into our life to lead us into this walk of love, which makes this way a narrow way. There's a lot of different things that have the name of God and the name of Christ, but it doesn't lead you to a journey of a walk of love. It doesn't lead you to lay down your life. It doesn't challenge you to walk in patience and kindness. It doesn't challenge you to endure the trial and let God have His way. What it does, it teaches us to find comfort in this world. Do you ever remember now listen. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. There's just about... Well, anyway, I just have to tell you for the sake of the men, be merciful and kind toward me. But one of my favorite shows is Anne of Green Gables. Yeah. It just is. I'm sorry. I think that's not a man show. Have you ever seen Anne? Lois, you've got to see Anne of Green Gables. It's this fiery red-headed girl that's an orphan that goes to live with this family. It's the journey that she has. But there's one part, and she says, I want to be good, but I'd also like to be just a little bit wicked. Because there's this idea, if I'm good, then that makes me not enjoyable, life not fun. And isn't that the lie? If I'm just a little wicked, then life will be fun and enjoyable. And we want to give place. I'd like to be a devilish angel. Can't I just be an angel but have a little? And listen, that's what we give place to. And it's that walk of compromise. And the church becomes a house of compromise. It becomes a place where we're no longer challenged to lay down our life and to take up the cross and what that looks like and what it means. He says there are those that they're going to cry out, Lord, Lord. I don't understand. Look at all the works of right, the things that I've done, the expressions I've made. He said, but you lived your life practicing lawlessness. You did not love me with all your heart. There were other things that were more important to you. And you did not love your neighbor as yourself. You did not accept, we're going to look at this moment, accept or receive the Spirit of God to lead you into righteousness. You didn't want that. And then he goes in, I want to read, we'll come back to Matthew 7, one more passage, Psalms 32. Yes. Psalms 32, I was hoping that was it. Verse 1, it says, how blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Selah, think about that. How blessed, how fortunate is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Verse 5, David said, I acknowledge my sin to you. Well, you know what? All right, let's read verse 2. Can't skip. How blessed is the man in whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and whose spirit there is no deceit. When I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted away through my groanings all day long. There's a song, I might have shared this last week, but I think it's kind of a country song. It's by a guy named Tim Meadows, and it's called Sideways. And basically the song talks about, I tried to push things down and it came out sideways. And the same thing here, David says, the more I tried to hide things, press it down, cover it up, it came out in some way. When I stayed quiet about my sin, my body began to waste away. Verse 4, for day and night thy hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was drained away as with the fever heat of summer. Didn't he say the broad way leads to what? Destruction. The mind set on the flesh leads to destruction. Verse 5, I acknowledged my sin to thee, and my iniquity I did not hide. I said, I will confess my transgression to the Lord. Thou didst forgive the guilt of my sin when I brought it to the light, when I came to the light. Verse 6, therefore let everyone who is godly pray to thee in a time when thou mayest be found. Surely in a flood of great waters thou shalt not reach him. Thou art my hiding place, thou dost preserve me from trouble. For thou dost surround me with songs of deliverance. Listen to verse 8. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. Now listen to that for a moment. He says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. Do you believe, if your heart is tender, open, and teachable, that God Himself will teach you and lead you in the way that you should go? He says, I will counsel you with my eye upon you. But then He gives you instruction. Do not be as the horse or as the mule, which have no understanding, whose trappings include bit and bridle to hold them in check. Otherwise, they will not come near to you. Many are the sorrows of the wicked, but he who trusts in the Lord, loving kindness shall keep him. So here's what the point I'm going to try to make. Guys, what keeps us so often is our own stubbornness. He says, listen, I'll instruct you in this narrow way. Listen, you don't have to be afraid of whether or not you're on the... If you listen to me, I will instruct you. I will show you. I will let peace be the borders of your heart. I will guide you. I will counsel you. But he says, don't be like the horse or the mule that resist. They need the bridle to hold them in check and to keep them restrained. I heard a great analogy by a friend named Milton, and I found the same analogy true in my own life by the same situation. He had a dog named Sam. I had a dog named Taylor. All my life, this was the one dog in my journey that was my dog. He was a golden retriever. Beautiful. Taylor, sweet spirit. The kids could bury him in sand. If he ever got tired, he'd just shake it off and move in. They would ride on him. They would lean on him. When I was at home, he was my dog. He would sit there and he would watch me all the time. If I'm sitting in the house, he would sit where he could watch me. If I'm outside, he sits where he can watch me. If Rebecca and I are out walking, he follows me. He looks toward me. He would just watch me all the time. He wanted to please me. And it was like he knew where I was going, what I was doing. He ended up passing away, got in some poison. I remember, I always told people, and I've told all my animals, and y'all have to forgive me, but I do have a talk with all the animals that come into my house. Listen, I'm not spending $5,000 for you to get a new hip. I will pray for you, and that's the best you're going to get at our house. Until it was my dog. And when Taylor was laying there, I took him to the emergency room. I sat with him as they put an IV in him. They did several things to try to help him and get him through that situation. But I'll tell you, Taylor was looking at me all the time. He wanted to please me. God says, don't be the one that's constantly being restrained. How much problems does our stubbornness get us because we won't listen and we won't hear? Jesus finishes the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, with this parable about two men. He says one was a wise man, one was a foolish man. There were several things in common about these men. They were both building a house. Listen, up a few scriptures you see there's two roads, two paths. Now you see him saying there's two men building a house. There's two houses being built. As we sit in this place, all of us are building a house. We're taking information into our heart and building our life upon it. So, they're building a house. The second thing in common was they both heard the Word of God. It says the wise man heard and the foolish man heard and. What they did with the instruction of the Word. One received it. The other one acted like the horse and the mule. They resisted. They had something better, a better way. God says forgive. But you know what? There's always 100 excuses for why I don't have to forgive. It doesn't necessarily apply to me. The Lord says lay down your life. But I've got 100 excuses why I shouldn't let them talk to me that way, or walk through me like that, or act that way. We always have excuses. They're both building, they're both listening, and the last thing, they both encounter the wind, the rain, and the storm. Listen, being a Christian doesn't keep you from the wind, and the rain, and the storm. You experience the wind, rain, and storm just like everybody else does. The question is, and the outcome is, does the house remain? Does it stay? What's the end result of what you've been doing? And both of these parts, the narrow way and the building of the house, both really focus on the end of the decisions you make. One decided to go on a broad way. They didn't necessarily want to have to aim. They didn't necessarily want to have to discipline. They didn't necessarily want to have to sacrifice. They didn't necessarily want to have to endure. They wanted to walk in an easier journey. But the outcome of that, as though it may seem good, is destruction. The end is going to cost you your life. The one who chose a narrower way, the one who chose to receive the instruction, the commands of the Lord, to endure hardship, it says the end of that way is life. The one who built a house by taking the time to lay a foundation, focusing on that which cannot be seen. Listen, so much of sometimes the religious instruction and even the worldly instruction is the focus on what can be seen. Focusing on the curtains. Focusing on what the house is going to be painted. Focusing on what color are the roof things. What's the gutter going to look like? But it says the wise man first focuses on that which is hidden, that can't be seen, the foundation. He then begins to focus on the internal parts of the house, the structure. Those things that can't always be seen by human hands. But when the storm comes, one endures and the other falls away. So, as we finish, I would just encourage you to consider, how would people describe you? Would they say about you as they watch you walk through something, they belong to that way? That way, if any man wishes to come after me, he must take up his cross. I see them reviled without reviling in return. There's something different about their life. I see them running with aim and purpose to their journey. I see them cultivating and focusing on spiritual things. Would you be described that way? Would other people, like it says in Matthew chapter 5, see your good works and what you do does not necessarily cause them to look at you, but it causes them to glorify your Father who is in heaven? There was a lady at the apartments today who gave a testimony how she had been just abused by husbands and just had several things and just had lived a lifestyle that took her a certain way. But then when she met Christ through somebody at home, when she came back home, her mom said, "You're not the same person. There's something different about you." She belongs to the way. You see, the way that she was on was now different than the way that she was on. And the last thing I'll point out is, you can tell me all you want to that you're headed to Dallas. But if all the signs around your life are saying Galveston, you need to start reading the signs. And I'm telling you, all of us, if we'll step back and look around us, and we become aware of the signs around us, God's given us plenty of opportunities to recognize which direction we're heading and the way that which we're going. And I'll tell you, even as believers, obviously there's saved and lost, but then there's the part of believers. You know, listen, I can start getting off, and God puts the signs there all the way saying, listen, you need to get back on. You're heading the wrong way. And things are going to get harder and harder and harder. But if you'll listen to me, I'll get you back on. this path. And then what appears to be narrow to others is life to those who embrace Him. The only thing God's stripping from you is the things that are destroying you. Let's pray. Father, as we come to you, Lord, I just think of the description of believers in the book of Acts. They belong to this way. Lord, I think of what it means to confess Jesus as Lord. It means to say the same thing as you're saying. And so, Lord, I just pray that you would just bring about in us an awareness once again. Lord, after talking about the narrow and the broad way, you went right into the false prophets. Those who put on sheep's clothes. They look like sheep, but inwardly are ravenous wolves, filled with greed and mischief and ambition and pride. Lord, they're like clouds that look like they should have water. There should be something nourishing and life-giving in them, but nothing comes from them. Lord, you said to be aware of this, to be on the alert. Because if we begin to receive that message, we'll find ourselves compromising things around us. And then you lead into, Lord, that not everybody who says, Lord, Lord, is going to enter in. And it's not because you're trying to surprise or trick people. It's because we continue to practice lawlessness. We did not love you with all of our heart. We did not allow the grace of God into our life to teach us how to walk in love. We wanted to go our own way. And we thought we had a better way. A way that incorporates God but lets us have this world and our own nature at the same time. And Lord, you said it's foolishness. And then you left us with that last parable about a teachable heart and a stubborn heart. Two men that heard God and heard the words of God and heard the instruction of God. But one had convinced himself he had an easier way that would get the same outcome. And one had convinced himself that there was a purpose to the hardship, a purpose to the difficulty, that God was building in him a house that would last the storm and that would be there when the sun rose again. So Lord, teach us not to be stubborn, not to be resistant. Lord, I just know the saying that experience is a man's best teacher, but it's a fool's only teacher. Because a fool cannot receive instruction. So he has to make the mistakes himself again and again and again. Lord, teach us and help us to walk away with something to consider tonight. In Jesus' name.